The heavy smell of salt water usually calms my nerves, but as I looked at the man sitting in my passenger seat, I realized that the ocean was the last thing that would save me tonight. I had been driving for nearly 10 hours, and the fog rolling off the coast was so thick that the world beyond my headlights simply ceased to exist. Why did I pull over when I saw him standing by the rusted sign for the terminal? I told myself it was because the last ferry was leaving in 30 minutes, and no human being should be left out in this damp, freezing darkness. But as he buckled his seatbelt with a slow, deliberate click, he didn't look at me. He just stared straight ahead at the swirling mist. "You are exactly on time," he whispered, and his voice sounded like dry leaves skittering across a pavement. I felt a cold shiver crawl down my spine because I had never met this man in my life, yet he spoke as if he had been checking his watch for my arrival. The road to the ferry is a narrow, winding strip of asphalt that hugs the jagged cliffs of the coastline. There are no streetlights here, only the rhythmic sweep of my windshield wipers and the low hum of the engine. I tried to break the silence by asking him where he was headed, but he didn't answer right away. He reached out a gloved hand and adjusted the air vent, directing the cold air right onto my knuckles. The ferry doesn't wait for the living, and it certainly doesn't wait for the lost, he said, turning his head just enough for me to see the moonlight reflecting in his wide, unblinking eyes. I laughed nervously, trying to play it off as a joke, but my hands were shaking so hard I had to grip the steering wheel until my white knuckles ached. I wondered why a man with no luggage was heading to a terminal that led to a deserted island chain at midnight. Was he meeting someone, or was he making sure that I reached the water's edge alone? The tension in the car was becoming a physical weight, pressing against my chest and making it hard to breathe. Every time I glanced at the rearview mirror, I caught him watching the side of my face with an intense, predatory focus. He began to speak again, but this time his voice was different. It was rhythmic, almost like he was reading from a script of my own life. "You live in the house with the blue door, don't you?" he asked, and my heart skipped a beat as the car swerved slightly toward the edge of the cliff. "You have that habit of leaving the porch light on, thinking it keeps the shadows away, but you never realize that shadows are just waiting for the light to burn out." How could he know that? I had never seen this man in my neighborhood, and I lived miles away from this desolate stretch of coast. I felt a sudden, frantic urge to slam on the brakes and tell him to get out, but we were miles from any house, and the darkness outside looked even more dangerous than the man sitting next to me. The road began to descend toward the docks, and the fog grew so dense that I could barely see 3 feet in front of the hood. The passenger leaned closer to me, his breath smelling faintly of old copper and sea salt. "Do you know what happens when a car goes over the edge in a place like this?" he asked, his voice dropping to a low, intimate crawl. "The water is so cold that your muscles lock up instantly, and you spend your last few seconds looking up at the surface, wondering why you decided to pick up a stranger on the final night of your life." I felt a surge of pure, icy adrenaline dump into my bloodstream as I realized this wasn't a random encounter. He wasn't looking for a ride. He was narrating a sequence of events that he intended to make real. I looked at the GPS, and it showed we were only 2 minutes from the pier, but those 2 minutes felt like an eternity in a cage with a wolf. I noticed his hand slowly moving toward the pocket of his heavy coat, and the silhouette of something long and metallic began to emerge. I knew that if I reached the pier and stopped the car, I would be trapped in the seat while he finished whatever he had planned. My mind raced through every possible escape, but the cliff was on one side and a wall of rock was on the other. I had to create a distraction, something that would break his concentration and give me a fighting chance to get away. As we rounded the final bend and the flickering lights of the ferry terminal appeared through the mist, I saw the wooden barricade that led to the old, abandoned dock. Instead of following the curve toward the loading ramp, I gripped the wheel and prepared myself for a move that would either save me or end everything right there. "Why are you slowing down?" he hissed, his hand gripping the object in his pocket tightly as he sensed my change in energy. I didn't answer him. Instead, I waited until the very last second before the turn. I slammed my foot onto the brake with everything I had, causing the tires to scream against the wet pavement and the car to fishtail violently. The sudden jerk threw him forward, his head cracking against the dashboard with a dull thud that echoed through the cabin. Before he could recover or pull his hand from his pocket, I unbuckled my seatbelt and threw the door open, rolling out onto the cold, gravelly ground. I didn't look back to see if he was coming. I just ran toward the bright, industrial lights of the ferry where the crew members were already beginning to pull up the ramp. I screamed for them to stop, my voice raw and desperate against the wind. The deckhands saw me sprinting through the fog and held the gate for a few precious seconds as I leapt onto the metal floor of the boat. I collapsed there, gasping for air, as the engines roared and the gap between the boat and the dock began to grow. When I finally gathered the courage to look back at the shore, I saw my car idling at the edge of the pier with the passenger door wide open. The man was standing under the single, flickering streetlight of the dock, perfectly still. He wasn't chasing me, and he wasn't angry. He simply raised a hand in a slow, mocking wave as the fog swallowed him whole. I sat on the cold deck of the ferry for the entire crossing, watching the dark water and knowing that the only reason I was still breathing was because I refused to let him finish the story he had started writing for me. I knew the moment he sat down that I should have kept my doors locked, but the rain was coming down in such thick, gray sheets that his silhouette on the curb looked more like a drowning ghost than a threat. I didn't even check the app properly before he pulled the door open, bringing a gust of freezing, metallic-smelling air into my warm cabin that made the hair on my arms stand straight up. He didn't say hello, he didn't offer a name, and he didn't even look at me through the rearview mirror. He simply leaned back into the shadows of the rear seat and whispered a destination that I knew for a fact was an abandoned construction site 10 miles outside the city limits. I felt a cold knot of regret tighten in my stomach as I pulled away from the curb, the streetlights reflecting off the wet pavement like neon blood. Why did I let him in when my gut was screaming at me to drive away as fast as possible? As we left the familiar glow of the downtown district, the silence inside the car became so heavy that I could hear the wet clicking of his tongue every time he shifted his weight. I tried to make small talk, asking him if he was heading home for the night, but he just let out a low, dry chuckle that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm going exactly where I need to be, and so are you," he said, his voice sounding like gravel being crushed under a heavy boot. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my fingers began to go numb, and I noticed that he was leaning forward, closing the gap between the front and back seats until I could feel the heat radiating off his body. He wasn't looking at his phone or the scenery. He was staring at the back of my neck with a focused, predatory intensity that made me want to scream. The city lights faded into the distance, replaced by the skeletal remains of old oak trees that lined the narrow mountain road we were now climbing. There were no other cars on this route, and the fog was starting to swallow the road ahead of us, turning the world into a claustrophobic tunnel of gray and black. I glanced at the GPS, hoping for a detour or a gas station, but the screen was flickering erratically before it finally went dark, leaving me alone in the dark with a stranger who seemed to know the way better than any machine. "Take the next left," he commanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous, intimate whisper that sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through my system. That turn led to a logging trail that had been closed for years, a place where the forest was so dense that no one would hear a horn honking or a person crying out for help. I felt a sudden, sharp pressure against the back of my seat, and I realized he had placed his hand directly behind my heart, pressing firmly as if he were measuring my pulse through the upholstery. "You're driving a little fast, don't you think?" he asked, and I could hear the sound of a metal zipper being slowly undone in the back seat. The sound was deafening in the silence of the car, a slow, methodical rasp that told me he was reaching for something he didn't want me to see yet. My mind began to race through every horror movie I had ever seen, every news report about drivers disappearing into the night, and I realized that if I didn't do something now, I would just be another unsolved mystery on a cold police file. I needed to break his composure, to flip the script before he could finish whatever he had planned for me in the darkness of those woods. I saw a sharp bend in the road ahead, one marked by a rusted yellow sign and a steep drop-off into a shallow ditch filled with soft mud and tall grass. I didn't slow down as I approached the curve. Instead, I felt a strange, calm clarity wash over me as I realized that a controlled crash was better than a quiet execution. "What are you doing?" he hissed, his voice finally losing its calm edge as he felt the car accelerate into the turn. I didn't answer him. I just braced my body and jerked the wheel hard to the right, sending the car sliding off the pavement and into the embankment with a violent, bone-jarring thud. The airbags didn't deploy, but the impact was enough to throw him sideways, his head snapping against the window with a sickening crack that bought me the seconds I desperately needed. I didn't wait to see if he was conscious. I scrambled for the door handle, falling out into the mud and the freezing rain that felt like heaven against my panicked skin. I ran blindly into the trees, my lungs burning as I pushed through the thorns and the brush, not stopping until I reached a high ridge where I could look back down at the road. Below me, the car sat tilted in the ditch, its headlights cutting through the fog like two dying eyes. I watched with my heart hammering against my ribs as the back door slowly creaked open and a dark shape climbed out, stumbling and clutching its head in the rain. He stood there for a long time, looking into the woods where I was hiding, but the darkness was my ally now, and the sound of a distant police siren, triggered by my car's automatic crash response, began to wail in the valley. He turned and vanished into the shadows in the opposite direction, leaving me shivering but alive, a final passenger who would never forget the face of the man who tried to take me to nowhere. The airport terminal was a ghost town by 2 in the morning, and the neon hum of the parking garage felt like the only sign of life in a world made of concrete and shadows. I had been driving for 12 hours straight, and my eyes were burning from the glare of oncoming headlights. So when the notification for a final pickup flashed on my screen, I almost declined it out of pure exhaustion. But the fare was high, and the destination was a remote estate on the edge of the city. So I pulled my car into the designated zone and waited for a man named Elias to appear from the sliding glass doors. A man in a sharp, expensive-looking suit stepped out of the darkness, checking his watch with a hurried flick of his wrist before he opened my back door and slid inside without a word. "Let's get moving. I'm in a significant rush," he said, his voice cold and clipped, sounding like someone who was used to giving orders and having them followed without question. I started the engine and began the long drive away from the safety of the airport lights, but as I glanced down at my phone to start the navigation, my heart stopped for a beat because the app suddenly chimed with a notification that the rider had canceled the trip. I looked in the rearview mirror, intending to ask the man why he had canceled the ride, but the words died in my throat when I saw him staring at the back of my head with a look of pure, focused malice. "Is there a problem?" he asked, and even though he was smiling, his eyes remained as flat and lifeless as two pieces of flint. I tried to explain that the app showed the ride was over, but he leaned forward, and I saw that he wasn't holding a phone at all. He was holding a heavy, leather-bound folder that he gripped with white-knuckled intensity. "The app is mistaken, and you are going to drive me to the address I provided, or things are going to become very complicated for you very quickly," he whispered, his voice dropping an octave until it vibrated through the driver's seat. I felt a surge of cold dread wash over me as I realized that this man wasn't Elias, and that the real passenger was likely still standing at the terminal, wondering where his ride had gone. I was alone on a dark highway with a man who had hijacked my car through a simple, terrifying mistake of timing. As we drove further away from the city, the streetlights became sparse, and the towering pine trees began to crowd the edges of the road like silent sentries watching my descent into a nightmare. I tried to keep my breathing steady, but the silence in the car was being punctured by a rhythmic, metallic clicking coming from the back seat, a sound like a blade being snapped in and out of a casing. "Do you ever think about how easy it is for a person to just disappear?" he asked, his long, thin fingers tracing the edge of the door handle as if he were imagining the locks failing. I didn't answer, my mind racing through every possible scenario, wondering if I should try to flag down a passing car or if that would only provoke him into finishing me right there in the front seat. I noticed his eyes darting toward my phone every time a message light flickered, and I realized he was terrified of being tracked, which meant he was likely on the run from something much worse than the police. The high-tension silence was broken when I heard a muffled, vibrating sound coming from underneath the passenger seat, a frantic buzzing that didn't belong to my own phone. I realized with a jolt of horror that it was the real Elias's phone, which must have been dropped by the man before he got in. Or perhaps it belonged to someone else who had sat in this car earlier that night. The man in the back heard it too, and his entire body stiffened like a coiled spring, his hand reaching over the seat to grab my shoulder with a grip that felt like a steel vise. "Don't you dare touch that phone, and don't you dare slow this car down," he hissed, his face now inches from mine, his breath smelling of stale coffee and something chemically bitter. I knew then that I wasn't just a driver to him. I was a witness, and witnesses were liabilities that men like him didn't allow to live through the night. We were approaching a secluded stretch of the road where the bridge crossed over a dry creek bed, a place where the shadows were deep enough to hide a car for weeks without anyone noticing. I saw him shifting his weight, preparing to reach for my throat or the wheel, and I knew that the moment we reached the center of that bridge, my life would be forfeit. I had to act on the only advantage I had, which was my knowledge of the car's safety features and the terrain I had driven 1,000 times before. I didn't scream, and I didn't plead for my life. Instead, I waited until the very moment his hand let go of my shoulder to reach for the weapon he had hidden in his folder. I slammed my foot on the emergency brake and simultaneously cut the lights, plunging the interior of the car and the road ahead into absolute, crushing darkness. The sudden loss of momentum threw him forward against the back of my seat, and in the confusion of the pitch-black cabin, I fumbled for the door release and rolled out into the gravel, the sharp stones tearing at my palms. I didn't run into the woods. I knew he would expect that, so I crawled beneath the belly of the car, heart hammering against the pavement as I watched his polished shoes step out onto the road just inches from my face. He cursed under his breath, his voice sounding frantic and high-pitched now that he had lost control of the situation, and he began to fire blindly into the tree line, thinking I had fled into the forest. I waited until he was 20 feet away, his back turned to the vehicle as he searched the shadows, and then I reached up, grabbed the door frame, and hauled myself back into the driver's seat with a burst of strength I didn't know I possessed. I slammed the door and locked it just as he turned around, his face a mask of pure rage as he realized he had been tricked by his own prey. I shifted the car into gear and floored the accelerator, the tires spinning and spitting gravel into his face as I sped away into the night, leaving him stranded in the middle of nowhere with nothing but his leather folder and a dying phone. I didn't stop until I saw the bright, beautiful lights of a 24-hour truck stop, where I collapsed into the arms of a startled mechanic, knowing that I had survived the double booking that was meant to be my final ride. I never drove for a rideshare app again, because every time I hear a phone vibrate in a quiet room, I still feel the ghost of his hand on my shoulder, waiting for the car to stop.